Carbon's one of the fundamentals of life, along with oxygen and water.
All living things are made up of carbon and a range of other elements. But carbon has unique properties. It's in the air as carbon dioxide, and then it's able to form very complex chemicals within living things. It's the basis for our food, and it's the basis for sustainability in all of our ecosystems and in our farming systems. And if we misuse carbon and abuse the way that carbon flows naturally in the earth through the carbon cycle, then we do so in ways that will impact on us as a species.
If you're a piece of carbon in the atmosphere, these plants will breathe you in and then add a few hydrogen molecules to it and becomes a complex carbon compound which feeds everything. And the waste product is oxygen, which we all need. If the carbon, and we're talking about complex carbon now, we're not talking about carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we're talking about carbon that's been manufactured into a compound, a biological compound. As soon as it's in water, it doesn't get oxygen to it, so it's only broken down then by microbes or by plants feeding microbes, so that it's a closed cycle, very efficient. Whereas if it's up on that hillside, the sun shines on it and it goes back into a gas and it's back out where it started from. In a wetland, it doesn't escape.
Photosynthesis is the collection of the sun's energy by plants. Plants using this energy accumulate their nutrients and minerals and water from the soil, but also from the atmosphere. As they increase their carbon and water, they cool the landscape. So the more plants and animals that we have in the landscape, the cooler our landscape becomes. As we cool our landscape, we increase the hydrology of the landscape, and we also increase the energy of the landscape and the cycling of nutrients and minerals in the landscape. Rainfall is really interesting because we tend not to understand that the cooler the landscape, the more water is condensed from the atmosphere in that local landscape. And then if it's cooler, it also will retain nutrient and mineral and soil and more species and more biomass, which is animals and species and their function. So all these things are interrelated and connected together, and if in agro-ecosystems where we farm, we can just cool our landscape, we will have more water in the landscape, we'll have more function in the landscape, we'll increase our biomass in the landscape, and we'll have more to retain and more to export. Plants are the managers of the landscape, along with animals, which are very important also. Plants are the main captures of sun's energy and turn it into nutrient and mineral, which they build their bodies from. Animals eat that and they build their bodies from the plants, so the sun's energy transfers from one to the other and to us too, as we're animal.
The way of analysing a landscape is that the bigger the framework you've got of production, the same as if we were doing a photoelectric cell thing, the bigger the area of cells we can put down, the greater the productivity. That is a solar operated processor, and the bigger the area you can get, the more it processes. There's a thing, time and space. How much space is a plant occupying? How long does it take to grow? So when we do those two assessments, we look at this grass and it's occupying space, and if we dig through it, it's green right to the bottom. But that's only so deep. And we go to the tree and it's got grass right around the bottom and it's green right to the top. So we could easily say that that tree is 1,000 times more productive than the same patch of grass. And yet we don't do it like that. We go and clear the whole landscape so we can improve productivity, when in fact we've reversed it entirely, very much. And when we get to a situation like a grass like this, where it's green, which is only this little piece, it's gaining and growing. Where it's brown like this, it's going, it's oxidising away. So that's the time and space assessment. How much area is growing, like this piece, it's disappearing. Even though we don't see it, but we know it is. And if it grinds up, the wind will blow it away, the water will dissolve certain parts of it, it'll wash away. But not this piece. You could put that under a hose and it'll just keep getting bigger and bigger. We intend not to do that. That's one of the things that I see it's the most fundamental mistake we make in assessing landscape productivity.
Well, it's an unfortunate thing that has developed in our time, is that we tend to mine the biosphere and accumulate the atmosphere, and we really need to bring that around, reverse that, and actually mine the atmosphere to farm the biosphere. And as plants mine the atmosphere for us, we don't have to work so hard. As the landscape cools by plants intercepting the sun's rays from the earth, they use that energy to accumulate water, nutrients and minerals from both the soil and the atmosphere, and lock that into the biosphere for us. And then if we recycle those nutrient, minerals and water throughout our own local biosphere, our own subset of the biosphere, which is our farm, we can increase this biosphere, or the biomass of the biosphere, which is just plants and animals, and also increase the function of our landscape, which increases our food and water. So that's how it works. And if we don't know how it works, we can't make it work.
Well, when we understand biodiversity, and then we look at the roots of these plants, and we just start to bring it up, you'll find that here is really an incubator for all the soil processing microbes. This green area on top has been feeding these things in the ground, so that is an incubator for that processing factory. And if we just chop it off, you'll find the grass will grow right into those roots, because it's already got a factory there ready to process it for the plants to use it. And we don't have to turn it up or anything, it'll just live. And these plants don't grow forever, they only grow for a short cycle, seed and then finish. You know, we do tend to just instinctively accept certain processes when we realise that if we just worked with sunlight and knew that that ran everything, whereas we think that the roots are feeding the tree, we find that the sunlight is feeding everything and the tree is feeding whatever in the roots. The accumulated fertility in soils is the results of cycles of plants, and that's biodiversity. And we mentioned that in fact one plant won't live competitively in the residue of its own species, so each time it changes it makes more finite adjustments to the humus in the soil. So over a period of time, what was once an imbalanced soil becomes more and more balanced as each cycle of plants makes an adjustment to that in-ground balance. When we clear a landscape or stop the vegetation from growing, there is in cell numbers, in other words, there's so many cells in a sheep and the same number of cells in the soil. If we made an assessment, if we have 5 living sheep on the top, in the number of cells there's 83 living sheep equivalent in the factory in the soil. So when we take the vegetation off the top, now the factory in the soil is not being fed. A certain amount of it dies. If the sun shines on it, it dies very, very quickly. And what we're then doing is converting that factory in the soil to product that we can feed a crop on. But clearly, as we have done that, we went from running 5 sheep in a given area to now only running 1 sheep, and sometimes 1 sheep to 3 times that area. That means that we've lost that amount of soil factory. There's bacteria and then there's fungi And then in amongst that are all the nematodes, all the living little organisms that are related to all sorts of soil processes, and mostly in this factory recycling. But your two elementary ones are bacteria and fungi.
Our greatest hope is that we recognise that every plant is adding to the viability of the environment. Every plant. And that the simple process of the environment is recycling all that residue into ever increasing quality products. You can't get better with less, and so the more variety you've got, the more compounds you've got, and as you recycle it, the better the quality of the product that you produce. We have some really simple little statistical things recently science has offered us. We've got 3 million compounds in a mammal's body or a human's body. And it would be inconceivable to believe that a couple of plants could do that, or that it would already be available through the whole landscape. So the thing has to be worked on a production line, it has to be managed almost daily. And the only way that can happen is with a greater variety of plants and knowing how the water's moving through those plants. Otherwise, the thing must fail. Well, unfortunately, the object of how you work it out is that 3 million compounds is beyond our capacity to be able to understand and to manage daily. Yet there's been a system for thousands or tens of thousands of years evolved that managed to do that and come up with a balanced result. That's my first step. If it can do it for nothing and run for thousands of years, getting better all the time, that's my first step. I start off with that, and then if you want to interfere, you better be damn sure you know more about it than it's already capable of doing automatically. And I don't know that, but some people think they do. I haven't seen too many very successful, but they think they do.
Fundamentally, to function and process is accumulation and dispersal locally of all the elements of our landscape. The more we accumulate in our landscape of water and carbon or nutrient and mineral, the more functional the landscape and the more processes are occurring in the landscape.
So you're saying then that it's possible to actually change whether a landscape accumulates or disposes of carbon and water?
Yeah, the management of our landscape, which includes whether we export or retain carbon and water, and whether we manage the landscape naturally or artificially, really has a great bearing on whether the landscape is functional. Mainly in Australia today, until we get right up to the tops of valley systems, they're all dispersing. They're leaking their natural resources, their water and their carbon and their nutrient, mineral, and we're even losing species. Once we lose species in the landscape, we've lost function and process. And the more species we lose, the worse it gets.
But why should that bother me?
We all eat and drink, and its function and process in landscape and the accumulation of minerals and nutrients and water that actually feeds us and waters us. So the less of those components of the landscape we have, the less food and water there are for people and for all the other species. All volunteer plants in any landscape, like all plants, are the accumulators of mineral and nutrient for that landscape. And the only reason we have excessive or dominant species growth in landscape is because it's being disturbed in its chemical composition, if you like, the soil's chemical composition. And therefore it's invaded by species that are less desirable for farming or for our use. And these species really should be used to replace the mineral and nutrient that's lost in the soil, and that's why nature's put them there, is to indicate that those particular nutrients and minerals are now absent and they need to be brought in by those plants that are able to do that. We think we can do everything for ourselves, and because we're that way inclined, we tend to regard those plants as undesirable and we remove them, and so we therefore disturb the whole environment and reduce our ability to increase naturally in the landscape.
The environment is hugely resilient, and these weed plants get stuck on your clothes, and so they're everywhere. Not only that, you can bury them for 100 years, you dig them up and they still grow. So if we just realise that it's all there in a foolproof method, you know, they've either got the ability to be carried around everywhere and buried forever and then come up when the erosion digs them up, or they got 2 seeds in them so that they don't all grow together, and therefore there's so many backup systems. And so have we changed it a lot? Absolutely. Have we ruined it? Absolutely not. Because the backup systems, and whoever decided how to build this thing, probably recognised that humans could get involved and they'd bugger it all up, and then we could fix it again, you know. And so the capacity for a landscape to repair itself is quite amazing. And the short duration of the time, if we used every plant, and that's what we don't do, we tend to try and use trees which really need to be 50 years old minimum to make a great impact on the environment, and they need to be 500 years plus to make a substantial impact, and yet a weed plant can do it in 50 or 60 days and recycle 100% of its productivity. So if we want to fix something, we have to use these quick repair guys and then make sure we get the long-term plants to sustain it, to keep it going.